March 23rd, 1945. Night had fallen over the western bank of the Rhine. Cold wind rippled across the black water, carrying the smell of smoke and oil. German sentries pressed their faces to binoculars, scanning the opposite shore. Somewhere in the darkness, an army waited. For generations, the Rhine had been Germany's sacred wall. Every school child knew the stories. No foreign army had ever forced this river, while German soldiers stood on its banks. Even now, with Berlin trembling under the distant thunder of the Red Army, officers along the Western Front whispered the same belief. "The river will protect us," Lieutenant Wilhelm Steinberg wrote in his field notebook that evening. "The Americans have reached the Rhine, but they cannot cross. No army can." He was wrong, completely, fatally wrong. Across the water, unseen under the fading light, engines coughed to life. They did not sound like boats, nor like tanks. They were something else. Strange amphibious trucks, part land machine, part vessel. They had a name that made German officers laugh when they first heard it. The Duck. Those who laughed would not laugh for long. For 3 years, German engineers had studied how to defend this river. They built bunkers, range tables, artillery positions. Their manuals spoke with certainty. A crossing would require bridges, engineers, days of preparation. And every bridge would be destroyed. It was mathematics, doctrine, history, all on their side. But across the Atlantic, another kind of army had been working in silence. An army of designers, welders, and factory workers. Men and women who turned steel and rubber into something the Germans could not imagine. A truck that could swim. The idea was born not on a battlefield, but on an American beach, when a stranded patrol boat inspired a question. What if a truck could reach it through water? That simple problem ignited one of the quiet revolutions of the war. Within 6 weeks, engineers in Michigan produced the first prototype. They called it the DUKW, D for design year, U for utility, K for all-wheel drive, W for twin rear axles. But the soldiers who used it called it simply the Duck. By 1945, more than 20,000 of these ungainly vehicles had been built. They were not beautiful, they were not armored, but they could do something no other machine could. They could turn rivers into roads. The Germans had seen them before in Normandy and Italy. Intelligence officers noted them with a shrug. A curiosity, they said. Useful for beaches, irrelevant for continental warfare. A mistake that would cost them everything. Now, as the guns of the 21st Army Group prepared to fire, hundreds of ducks waited hidden near the Rhine, engines idling, crews tightening straps, infantry crouched inside, their faces blackened with soot. They knew this night would change history. Artillery opened at 1700 hours, a thunder that lasted for hours. The horizon glowed orange as thousands of guns tore into the eastern bank. To the Germans, it felt like the world was ending. To the Allies, it was the beginning of the end. When the firestorm paused, silence returned, heavy, deceptive. Then, faintly, from the smoke, came the growl of engines. Not the roar of tanks, not the splash of boats. Something stranger. From the western shore, shapes began to move into the water. Wheeled silhouettes gliding forward, headlights dimmed, exhaust hissing through mist. A German lookout shouted, "They are driving into the river!" At first, his comrades thought he was delirious. Then they saw it too. Vehicles rolling down the bank and floating. One after another, dozens, then hundreds. It looked impossible. Trucks, not boats. sailing through the current under the moonlight. The defenders opened fire. Tracer rounds danced across the water, red streaks cutting the dark. Shells burst, geysers rising and falling, but the ducks kept coming. Each carried a dozen soldiers, calm, silent, staring ahead. They did not slow down. They did not turn back. By the time German gunners corrected their aim, the first wave was already gone, swallowed by fog and night. Moments later, reports began flooding headquarters. Enemy troops on the eastern bank. Crossings everywhere. No sign of bridges. Panic spread through command posts. The maps on their tables no longer made sense. The river that had always divided friend from foe was no longer a barrier. It had become a highway. Somewhere along the line, an officer whispered, "It's not possible. They must have found a bridge." But there were no bridges. Only the ducks, hundreds of them, silent, relentless, climbing out of the Rhine as if the river itself had surrendered. The myth of the uncrossable Rhine died that night, not with explosions or glory, but with the quiet hum of engines built in Detroit. The roar of artillery still echoed through the valleys when the first ducks touched the eastern shore. Their hulls scraped against mud, wheels spinning once, then gripping solid ground. Engines growled as they climbed the bank, dripping water and smoke. From the darkness came the voices of Scotsmen, the 7th Battalion of the Black Watch, stepping out into Germany. They had crossed the Rhine without bridges, without engineers, without waiting. Behind them, more amphibious trucks appeared out of the mist like a mechanical tide. To the Germans watching from shattered bunkers, it felt like sorcery. They had destroyed every crossing point, mined every ford, registered every target for artillery. And yet the enemy was already on their side of the river. Major Hans Georg Model, son of the famous field marshal, tried to rally his men. But his telephone lines were dead, his maps obsolete. Reports came in from every direction. Enemy troops behind positions, mortar fire from unexpected angles, supply convoys appearing out of nowhere. The front no longer existed. It had dissolved in the flood. What the Germans could not see was the precision behind this chaos. For weeks, Allied engineers had studied the current, the banks, the wind. Each DUKW had been assigned an exact load: soldiers, ammunition, rations, balance to keep the hull steady in rough water. Each driver had practiced in smaller rivers, learning how to fight the current, how to steer with the rudder, while feeling the wheels float beneath. They were ready for this night long before the Germans even guessed it could happen. Sergeant Robert McPherson of the Black Watch later recalled, "We rolled down the bank, and suddenly we were floating. The American at the wheel didn't even slow down. It felt like driving through a storm, waves hitting us, shells exploding. But the duck just kept going. And when we reached the far side, we didn't stop. We drove straight into Germany. By 2 a.m, entire companies were across. Instead of fragile bridgeheads, there were scattered groups of infantry spreading inland like ripples. German artillerymen tried to locate the crossings, but there were too many. Every few minutes, somewhere along the 20-mile front, another DUKW would slide into the water, invisible under the smoke, and emerge where no defender expected. The river that was supposed to be Germany's shield had become its weakness. Each attempt to concentrate fire failed. Each counterattack struck empty space. The amphibious assault was everywhere and nowhere at once. At dawn, gray light revealed the impossible. Hundreds of ducks, moving in formation, shuttling men, fuel, and heavy weapons back and forth. They drove into the river, disappeared behind curtains of mist, and returned minutes later carrying more troops. German gunners stared through their optics in disbelief. No pontoons, no bridging equipment, no engineers, only trucks driving through water, as if the laws of war had changed overnight. Oberleutnant Karl Richard radioed his division headquarters. "Enemy armor is behind us. Repeat. Armor behind our position. We have seen no bridge construction. How did they get across?" His last transmission ended with the sound of shells striking near his post. What he had seen were not tanks at all. They were DUKWs, carrying heavy machine guns and anti-tank weapons, already digging in miles beyond the expected bridgeheads. The defenders had no time to react. The river that once bought them days of safety gave them only hours. Further north, British units under Major General Percy Hobart joined the assault. They brought their own amphibious beasts, the Buffalo LVT-4, tracked, armored, roaring through the surf. Side by side with the American DUKs, they formed the largest amphibious crossing in human history. By sunrise on March 24th, the Rhine's western bank was a factory of movement. Engines revving, water churning, orders shouted over radio static. On the far side, Allied soldiers raised rifles toward the smoking horizon, realizing they had done the impossible. And yet, this was only the beginning. For behind the assault troops came something even more powerful: logistics. The same vehicles that had carried men would now carry everything an army needs to live: food, fuel, ammunition, medicine. They would turn the Rhine into a conveyor belt of victory. In the villages east of the river, civilians woke to sounds they did not understand. The ground trembled, not with shelling, but with the vibration of engines. Through shattered windows, they saw silhouettes moving, vehicles glistening with water, driving through fields still steaming from bombardment. To them, it seemed as if the river itself had given birth to machines. Some German soldiers tried to hold the line. Many simply ran. A few stood frozen, staring at the amphibious columns rolling past. One later told Allied interrogators, "We were told the Rhine would save us. When I saw those trucks come out of the water, I knew the war was over." By mid-morning, more than 10,000 Allied troops were across. Their supply lines did not depend on fragile bridges or temporary ferries. They floated. Every hour brought more. DUKs loaded with mortars, jeeps, even light artillery. The river had lost its meaning. At 10 o'clock, a new sound filled the sky: the deep drone of hundreds of aircraft. Operation Varsity had begun. Thousands of paratroopers and glider troops descended on the far side, landing within sight of the floating convoys. It was the largest airborne drop of the entire war, synchronized to strike as the amphibious assault reached full strength. From above and below, the Allies crushed the last illusions of German defense. A German lieutenant wrote in his diary that day, "The enemy does not cross rivers. He ignores them." He was right. Every tradition of military engineering, every page of doctrine, was now meaningless. By evening, Allied divisions had pushed miles inland. The DUKs kept running, hour after hour, their engines steaming, their crews half-deaf from the noise. To them, it felt less like a battle and more like a relentless industrial process, a living assembly line crossing water. Somewhere near Wesel, an American mechanic wiped grease from his hands and said quietly, "This isn't war anymore, it's production." He was right. The Rhine was no longer Germany's wall. It had become Detroit's highway. Morning broke over the Rhine like the slow lifting of a curtain. The smoke was still thick, but shafts of light pierced through it, revealing a sight no German soldier could comprehend. The river, that proud, ancient barrier, was alive with motion. Engines roared, propellers churned, and the broad gray surface shimmered under the weight of hundreds of amphibious trucks. Each one carried men, weapons, or supplies. Each one was a small piece of a vast machine that no one on the eastern bank had believed could exist. German artillery opened up again, desperately seeking targets. Shells exploded in the current, sending fountains of water into the sky. But the ducks were too many. They crossed everywhere, not in neat rows or fixed lanes, but in swarms, unpredictable, unstoppable. The defenders' range tables were useless. Their carefully measured fire could hit a few, but never enough. Lieutenant Karl Richet of the 88th Battery shouted into his field phone, "They are crossing at every point! There is no bridge! There is no pattern!" Moments later, his line went silent forever. All across the front, the same scene played out. Disbelief, then collapse. By midday, the amphibious trucks had turned chaos into rhythm. They entered the river on the western shore, engines growling, water curling around their hulls. 10 minutes later, they climbed the eastern bank, their tires dripping, headlights shining through the smoke. They dropped off their cargo, troops, ammunition, even small vehicles, then turned around and went back for more. It was a perfect cycle. Fast, mechanical, relentless. The Rhine had become a production line. Lieutenant Colonel George Sims called it a DUKW highway. Each crossing point moved 50 vehicles per hour, everyone loaded with either 25 men or 2.5 tons of cargo. 50 vehicles an hour, around the clock. The Germans searched the skies for bridges to bomb, but there were none. Only the quiet procession of swimming trucks. Feldwebel Hermann Gutz, a paratrooper, wrote later, "They have vehicles that swim. We cannot stop them. We blow up bridges, and they laugh. They do not need bridges anymore." He was right. Every rule of warfare his generation had been taught had just dissolved under the current. Behind the front, American and British officers watched in wonder at their own creation. Never before had logistics looked like this. So fluid, so alive. Medical units used ducks to bring back the wounded, straight from the battlefield to hospitals on the western side. Fresh troops came the same way the next hour, stepping from the same vehicles that had carried the wounded away. Even hot food and coffee arrived by duck. It was war run like a factory shift. Technical Sergeant Anthony Russo of the 30th Infantry Division recalled it years later. "We were 3 miles inside Germany, and a duck rolled up dripping wet, carrying dinner. Still hot. The cooks loaded it on the far shore, and we ate it right there in a crater. It felt unreal, like the river itself had joined our side." The psychological effect on the Germans was devastating. To them, it seemed that the Allies had infinite machines and infinite energy. The Rhine, once a symbol of endurance, now mocked them. Their own generals had promised that no army could cross it in less than 2 days, even under ideal conditions. Yet here, the enemy had done it in 1 night, and by morning was sending trucks full of food across as if it were a ferry. Inside German command posts, confusion deepened. General Alfred Schlemm, commander of the 1st Parachute Army, had believed he could contain the assault within a few bridgeheads. Now he faced a front stretching for 20 miles, with enemy troops appearing behind his lines. He demanded reports. Where were the crossings? Where were the bridges? His staff had no answers. There were no bridges, and the crossings were everywhere. By afternoon, entire divisions were across. British, Canadian, and American units fanned out through the lowlands, their advance fed by an endless stream of amphibious trucks. The Rhine had lost its identity. It was no longer a boundary, but a bloodstream. Every hour, fresh supplies flowed eastward through it. Fuel for tanks, ammunition for guns, food for men, all carried by machines that floated. The German defenders tried to regroup, but each counterattack dissolved before it began. Everywhere they turned, there were more enemy soldiers, more trucks, more noise. Their radios crackled with fragments of messages. Enemy armor behind us. No bridge found. Request retreat. Panic was spreading faster than the water. At headquarters, an intelligence officer unfolded a map and stared at it for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Gentlemen, the river no longer exists." No one argued. By nightfall, the Allies controlled both banks along the central front. The ducks moved without pause, headlights shielded, water steaming from their engines. Drivers took shifts, sleeping at the wheel. Maintenance crews patched bullet holes with ration cans and scraps of metal. If a vehicle could float, it worked. If it sank, they dragged it out, fixed it, and sent it back in. Private Donald Burgett of the 17th Airborne Division remembered seeing them arrive after his own landing. "We were fighting near a crossroads when these truck boats came driving out of the woods. We thought we were dreaming. One of them stopped and shouted, 'Anybody need ammo?' We started laughing like madmen. The river was miles behind, and yet here they were, still dripping." By midnight, the full scale of the operation was clear. 3 Allied armies now had a continuous flow of supplies across the Rhine. The myth of the uncrossable river was gone forever. The Germans had spent years fortifying their frontier, and in one night it had turned into a highway. On the western side, General Eisenhower watched the shimmering lights of the crossing and smiled. He turned to his staff and said, "With these things, every river in Germany is now a road." His chief of logistics nodded. The war had entered its industrial phase, a phase Germany could not survive. By the morning of March 25, 1945, the German High Command no longer understood its own map. Messages arrived faster than they could be decoded. Entire battalions vanished, not destroyed, but simply swallowed by the speed of the Allied advance. Every assumption that had shaped the defense of the Rhine was collapsing hour by hour. General Alfred Schlemm gathered what remained of his staff in a farmhouse near Brunnen. The windows shook from distant explosions. He stared at the situation board, red pins marking units that no longer existed. His voice was flat. "Gentlemen," he said, "we prepared for the last war." He was right. They had fortified a line meant to stop bridges, not machines that ignored water itself. Reports told the same story from every sector. Enemy forces appeared miles behind the front. Convoys rolled through villages, thought secure only the day before. German artillery officers searched for bridges to shell, but there were none. They had built a defense against engineers, not against innovation. Feldwebel Otto Kraus of the 181st Infantry Division wrote to his wife on March 20th, "The Rhine will protect us. Even Napoleon could not cross it under fire." He never mailed the letter. When Allied troops reached his position, they found it folded in his pocket, stained with mud and river water. The confidence it carried had already drowned. In the air above, hundreds of Allied aircraft traced silver lines through the clouds. Paratroopers and glider troops drifted toward the horizon, landing almost beside the amphibious columns. The Germans had expected airborne raids deep in the rear. Instead, the sky fell directly onto their front line. For the first time, ground and air moved as one. Every new landing meant another pocket of resistance cut off before it could form. German soldiers tried to fight back with courage that had nowhere to go. Anti-tank guns fired at silhouettes in the mist, hitting nothing but water. Machine gun teams ran from bank to bank, always arriving a few minutes too late. They could see the ducks floating past like ghosts, leaving ripples that sparkled under the gray dawn. The river mocked them, calm, effortless, indifferent. At headquarters, an intelligence officer read aloud the latest interrogation reports. Captured soldiers described trucks that swam, machines that carried troops and supplies without bridges. The room went silent. One officer whispered, "That is impossible." Another replied, "It does not matter if it is impossible. It is happening." The German system had always trusted engineering precision. They built perfect weapons in small numbers, each one a masterpiece. The Allies built simpler ones in thousands. Perfection met quantity, and perfection drowned. In factories across Germany, production had slowed to a crawl under the bombing. Each vehicle required rare materials and expert hands. Meanwhile, in America, assembly lines worked like beating hearts. One machine failed, another replaced it an hour later. It was war by arithmetic, and the numbers were merciless. On the Rhine, the consequences of that philosophy became visible. German amphibious craft existed. Elegant, complex, but few. Barely 100 were ever built. The Allies had 20,000 ducks, each one cheap, crude, and replaceable. The outcome had been decided long before the first shot was fired. Lieutenant Joachim Engelmann, an intelligence officer of the 1st Parachute Army, later testified, "We studied every Allied crossing from Sicily to the Seine. We thought we understood their methods. We never imagined an enemy could make rivers irrelevant." His words captured the entire tragedy of the German defense. Not ignorance, but blindness, born of arrogance. By noon of that day, Allied forces were already 10 miles inland. German reserve armor tried to counterattack, but found nothing to strike. There was no concentrated bridgehead, no narrow road to target. Only scattered enemy groups supplied directly from the river by amphibious convoys. Tank commanders reported that the front no longer has edges. It had dissolved into movement. In one intercepted transmission, a German officer shouted, "We cannot identify the main attack. They are everywhere." He was right again, everywhere, because industry had replaced geography. The very concept of a fixed front was dying before his eyes. When Field Marshal Walter Model received word of the disaster, he understood what it meant. He had once said that Germany's salvation lay in the rivers. Our bridges may fall, but the water will defend us. Now that faith was gone, he ordered his staff to withdraw to new positions, but there were none left. Retreat led only deeper into chaos. Meanwhile, on the western shore, maintenance crews worked through the night under lantern light. Engines were stripped, hulls patched with tin, bullet holes sealed with candle wax. Men laughed about it. Good enough to float, they said, and that was all it needed to be. For every duck that sank, another rolled down the bank minutes later. The flow never stopped. Medical units joined the procession. Wounded paratroopers were lifted into the same vehicles that had carried them to battle. Within an hour, they were back on the western bank, bandaged and alive. In earlier wars, many would have died waiting for bridges to open. Now the river itself was an ambulance route. To the Germans who still fought, it felt unreal, like facing an enemy who had tamed nature. Feldwebel Hermann Goetz wrote again in his notebook, "How do you stop an army that can drive through water? We are not losing a battle. We are losing reason." That night, as the stars flickered above the silent current, the outcome was already decided. The Rhine, Germany's oldest protector, had become its quiet executioner. Not through blood, but through technology. Not through courage, but through imagination. The river did not need to be conquered. It had simply been made irrelevant. By the evening of March 25, 1945, the battle for the Rhine was no longer a battle. It had become a reckoning. On maps in Allied headquarters, the front looked like a tide pouring eastward. But inside German command posts, it looked like the end of the world. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann of the 185th Division opened his war diary for the last time. "The enemy crosses everywhere," he wrote. "Our artillery cannot find a target. The river no longer protects us." Hours later, his unit ceased to exist. No official record marked where it died. It simply vanished beneath the flood of progress. For centuries, the Rhine had defined Germany's western soul, a symbol sung about in poems and carved into memory. Now, the sacred river carried the echo of engines and the rattle of treads. German soldiers stared at the water that had once guarded them, and they felt something break inside. Not fear. Recognition. A paratrooper captured near Wesel told his interrogator, "We were prepared for soldiers. We were not prepared for factories." He was right. The war had turned industrial, fought not in trenches, but in assembly lines, foundries, and design offices thousands of miles away. Each duck crossing the river was not just a vehicle, it was a message. You cannot outfight production. By dawn of March 26th, the scale of collapse became clear. In 72 hours, the Allies had moved 15,000 men, over 1,000 vehicles, and thousands of tons of supplies across what had once been Germany's greatest barrier. German officers had predicted that such an operation would take 2 weeks at best. It had taken 3 days. 3 days to end 2,000 years of faith in the Rhine. In villages near the river, civilians awoke to the sound of foreign voices. Children peeked through shutters and saw dripping trucks rolling through their streets, crewmen smiling and waving. One old man crossed himself and whispered, "If they can drive through rivers, they will never stop." He was right again. General Schlemm's 1st Parachute Army no longer existed as a fighting force. Entire regiments surrendered without orders. Prisoners spoke openly, almost with relief. "We blew every bridge," said one sergeant, "but they do not need bridges. We are fighting a people who make their own paths." The sentence would echo through history like a confession. On the western bank, General Eisenhower visited the crossing sites. He watched the ducks sliding in and out of the water like patient creatures from another world. Steam rose from their engines. The air smelled of oil and victory. Turning to General Bradley, Eisenhower said quietly, "With these things, every river in Germany is a highway." Bradley nodded. "The Germans are just figuring that out." Across the front, Allied soldiers were too busy to celebrate. They patched holes, refueled engines, cleaned weapons. To them, it felt like routine work. One more mission, one more crossing. But somewhere in the back of every mind lay the same thought. We've just done the impossible. The Germans, meanwhile, entered a silence deeper than defeat. In captured diaries and letters, the same phrases appeared again and again. We prepared for the wrong war. We expected bridges. We never imagined swimming trucks. Intelligence officers gathered these fragments and shook their heads. They had known of the DUKW for years, seen it in photographs from Sicily and Normandy, but they had filed it away as an oddity, a curiosity of American excess, like Coca-Cola at the front, like ice cream machines on ships. They had laughed, and now they were drowning in that laughter. At a captured headquarters, Allied officers found a report written a month before the crossing. It mentioned the ducks exactly 3 times and dismissed them each time as coastal supply craft. It estimated that perhaps 100 existed in all of Europe. The truth was 20 times that number. The report was marked confidential, final. It was indeed final. That evening, rain began to fall over the river. Drops struck the steel hulls, hissing softly. Drivers wrapped themselves in blankets and stared across the dark water. They were exhausted, soaked, half-deaf from the constant thunder of engines. But they knew what they had done. They had rewritten the rules of war. On the eastern side, the German counterattack finally came. Late, uncoordinated, desperate. A handful of tanks and assault guns tried to strike near vessel, hoping to destroy what they still imagined as a bridgehead. But there was no bridgehead. There was no single point to hit. The enemy was everywhere, dispersed, supplied, and unbreakable. When the tanks reached the riverbank, they found nothing but water and the sound of distant engines on the other shore. They fired into the fog anyway, as if trying to shoot at an idea. Oberst Hinrich von Lüttichau, commanding what was left of a Panzer brigade, later wrote, "I saw American trucks emerge from the river, still wet, driving like nothing had happened. In that moment, I understood. We had lost not a battle, but an entire era." He was right. The old age of craftsmanship, of patient perfection, of elegant war machines, it had died in the water. When Field Marshal Montgomery received word that 3 Allied armies were across and moving freely, he simply said, "The Germans expected us to cross the Rhine. They did not expect us to drive across it." It was perhaps the most accurate sentence of the entire campaign. As night fell again, thousands of ducks continued their steady rhythm. Some carried ammunition, some medical teams, some wounded men wrapped in blankets. For the first time in history, a river crossing worked both ways at once, life flowing east, safety flowing west. Even as shells burst overhead, there was order in the chaos, a pulse in the water. It felt less like war and more like a civilization at work. From a distance, the lights of the crossing looked almost peaceful, small sparks moving over the surface, reflected in the current. To the Germans watching from the ruins, it must have seemed as though the river itself had chosen a side. And it had. The Rhine, once a wall of pride, had become a mirror, showing each nation what it truly was. For Germany, it reflected a fading empire of precision. For the Allies, it reflected a world built on invention and mass production. The outcome had never been in the trenches. It had been decided in the factories. And somewhere, amid the hum of engines and the rhythm of waves, a quiet truth emerged. They were not fighting soldiers anymore. They were fighting a civilization. March 26, 1945. The Rhine no longer roared with battle. It hummed with machinery. Engines idled. Cranes swung. Radio operators called coordinates through the fog. The crossing that had begun in chaos now moved with the rhythm of industry. Shifts, schedules, efficiency. It was no longer war as the Germans understood it. It was production. In a small farmhouse east of Wesel, General Alfred Schlemm met his surviving officers. They looked like ghosts, uniforms soaked, eyes hollow, papers scattered across a wooden table. The general's voice was tired but clear. "Gentlemen, we are not facing an army anymore. We are facing a system." Outside, they could hear the distant rumble of trucks driving through water. Every message from the front brought new despair. The 1st Parachute Army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Entire battalions surrendered without orders. Those who tried to retreat found themselves surrounded by enemy convoys that seemed to come out of the river itself. When captured, many soldiers asked the same question: how can we fight people who build roads over water? By nightfall, Allied engineers were expanding their duck highways. What began as assault routes had become permanent supply corridors. Fuel, food, ammunition, even mail, all flowed east across the current. One company of amphibious trucks ferried wounded men back, while another carried hot meals forward. Everything ran on time. Even under shell fire, the logistics clock kept ticking. General Eisenhower visited again that day. Standing on a muddy embankment, he watched the shimmering lights of hundreds of DUKWs sliding through the mist. Their engines sounded like distant surf. He turned to his aide and said softly, "Every river in Europe will look like this before we're done." It was not a boast. It was an observation. The German command still clung to fragments of order. They issued counterattack plans, moved pins on maps, demanded bridges destroyed a second time. But their orders meant nothing. There were no bridges left to destroy, and no time to think. The Allied advance had erased distance itself. By the time a directive reached a division, that division no longer existed. Captured diaries tell the same story in human words. A young artillery officer wrote, "I watched trucks drive through the river like boats. We fired until our barrels burned, but they kept coming. It was not bravery. It was inevitability." Another soldier recorded, "They cross faster than we can reload. When the water obeys them, what is left to defend?" Far from the front, in a command bunker west of the Ruhr, Field Marshal Model received the final reports. He understood better than anyone what they meant. For 5 years, he had believed that discipline and courage could outthink machines. Now he saw the opposite, that machines built by a free people could outlast discipline itself. He dismissed his aides and sat alone for a long time. The war he had mastered no longer existed. Meanwhile, on the western bank, British correspondents described the crossing as the quietest miracle of the war. No trumpets, no parades, just trucks sliding through water, endlessly, efficiently. Some drivers painted names on their vehicles: Lucky Duck, Liberty Bell, Detroit Dream. The names carried humor, but also pride. They knew what they were doing would outlive the moment. That same afternoon, an extraordinary event took place. Prime Minister Winston Churchill arrived to witness the operation. He had waited 6 long years to see Germany breached, and he refused to let anyone else cross before him. Against Eisenhower's protests, he stepped aboard a landing craft and rode straight into the current. Cigar in mouth, coat flapping in the wind, he stood beside British officers who could barely believe it. Shells fell nearby, sending fountains of water skyward. Spray drenched the Prime Minister's hat, but he only smiled. When they reached the eastern bank, he bent down, scooped a handful of wet earth, and said, German soil. It was theater, but it was also history. The river that had once stopped empires now carried them. Churchill's crossing symbolized what the DUKW had achieved. It made the impossible ordinary. He could cross a front line not because the battle was over, but because the system worked so smoothly that his presence didn't interrupt it. There was no single bridge to block, no bottleneck to clear. Just motion. Constant, organized, unstoppable. For the German defenders watching from the ruins, the sight of amphibious convoys under British flags must have felt like a nightmare from which there was no waking. They fired a few shells in defiance, but the river swallowed the sound. The world they had built on fortresses and fixed lines was dissolving before their eyes. That evening, Allied soldiers huddled around their vehicles, drinking coffee made from river water filtered through tin cans. They laughed, traded cigarettes, and stared at the current that had once seemed endless. One mechanic said quietly, "Feels like the river's working for us now." His friend nodded. It switched sides. He was not wrong. The Rhine, Germany's mythic guardian, had become a servant of its conquerors. And with every splash of a propeller, with every wheel that gripped the far bank, an old world sank a little deeper into the mud. When the guns finally fell silent, the Rhine no longer belonged to war. Its surface, once torn by shells, now reflected sunlight and fragments of peace. The same amphibious trucks that had carried men into battle began to carry something else: life. At dawn, columns of DUKWs rolled down to the water, as they always had. But their cargo had changed. No more ammunition boxes, no more rifles. Now they carried food, blankets, and medicine. Some ferried German children across flooded fields to hospitals on the western bank. Others brought milk and bread to villages where nothing was left standing. Engines that once thundered toward the front now purred gently, like ferry boats of recovery. Private First Class Anthony DeMarco, who had driven his duck through artillery and darkness only weeks earlier, remembered his last crossing. There was no shooting, no shouting, just kids waving at us from the other side. We were still dripping water, still covered in mud. But this time, we were bringing chocolate instead of bullets. It was a different kind of victory, quiet, human, humble. In the ruins along the river, German civilians watched in stunned silence as the American trucks floated past. They had heard stories of cruelty, of vengeance, of endless punishment. Instead, they saw soldiers handing out bread. One woman near Wesel would later tell an Allied reporter, "They drove through the river like gods, but they acted like men." For the first time in years, she smiled. Within days, DUKW convoys were everywhere, hauling supplies to field hospitals, evacuating the sick, delivering mail to frontline units now deep inside Germany. The same vehicles that had turned the tide of battle now kept an entire continent alive. Engineers joked that the ducks had become post-war delivery trucks for humanity. It wasn't far from the truth. Across the Allied camps, soldiers began painting new slogans on their hulls. One read, "No bridges needed." Another, "From war to work." A third simply said, "Hope floats." Those crude letters summed up the transformation of an army that had learned to use industry not just for destruction, but for restoration. Meanwhile, in Berlin's collapsing government bunkers, the news spread like wildfire. The Rhine had fallen in 3 days. Factories were still burning, roads gone, morale broken. Even propaganda could not hide the truth. Goebbels wrote in his diary, The enemy crosses our sacred river with machines that defy imagination. Our last natural defense is gone. The war is lost. He was right. The war wasn't just lost. It had been rendered obsolete. The idea of fortress warfare, of rivers as walls, of lines as salvation, died with the Rhine. German officers who had once prided themselves on tactical mastery now stared blankly at reports written by junior clerks describing how Americans drove across the river as if it were a road. The shock was not only military, it was philosophical. How could a culture built on perfection compete with one built on possibility? After the surrender, Allied intelligence teams toured captured German facilities. They found notes, blueprints, and studies on river defense, all meticulously written, and all useless. One folder labeled Amphibious Threat Unlikely was still lying open on a desk in a half-destroyed bunker. It read, "The Americans lack the industrial focus to develop mass amphibious transport." That single sentence told the entire story of Germany's defeat. While the high command collapsed, the people survived, and often it was the DUKW that made survival possible. Flooded villages received aid before the roads were repaired. Farmers stranded by destroyed bridges saw olive-drab trucks gliding over the water, bringing seed grain and tools. Nurses crossed rivers to reach the wounded. Chaplains followed with words of comfort. The ducks had turned from weapons into lifelines. One British sergeant, William Davies, recalled using his amphibious vehicle to rescue tank crews from burning wrecks. "We'd drive right up to the fire. Our hulls were soaked, so the heat didn't bother us. We pulled men out who'd thought they were done for. Some were German, some ours. Didn't matter anymore." His words captured the strange grace that followed victory, mercy born from exhaustion. Even Field Marshal Montgomery, known for his cold precision, admitted to a moment of wonder. In a letter to his staff, he wrote, "The enemy expected a siege. Instead, we gave them a ferry service. Never underestimate what practical men can do when imagination guides their hands." He was describing more than the crossing. He was describing the birth of a new age. On the western side, mechanics still labored through the night. Engines needed oil, pumps leaked, propellers cracked. But morale never dropped. To every man who patched a hole or tightened a bolt, there was a quiet satisfaction. They knew that history would remember generals, not drivers. But it was the drivers who had carried the future across that river. In the months that followed, the DUKW would serve in new roles, delivering food to starving families in the Netherlands, ferrying refugees across flooded plains, even rescuing livestock from rising waters. What had begun as an instrument of war became a symbol of endurance. It proved that the same tools that destroy can also rebuild. One American officer summed it up in a single sentence that would appear in post-war reports. "The Ducks didn't just win the battle. They taught us what victory should look like." By summer, the Rhine's banks bloomed again. Children played near the same water that had once divided armies. Sometimes they would see an old DUKW drifting downstream, paint fading, hull rusted, and shout, "Schwimmwagen! Swimwagon!" They laughed, not knowing that those strange machines had carried the world into its next chapter. May had come. The thunder of war was fading, replaced by the murmur of rebuilding. Germany was still smoldering, its cities hollow and silent, yet the Rhine flowed on. Calm now, indifferent, eternal. It had seen Romans, emperors, and kings. It had been a frontier of pride and myth for 2,000 years. But in the spring of 1945, that myth drowned beneath the ripples of industry. The amphibious trucks, those strange, unglamorous ducks, had done what no fortress, no doctrine, no miracle weapon could undo. They had turned geography into an illusion. Every mile of river, every obstacle, every wall of water that once promised safety had been made irrelevant by imagination and production. The Rhine was not conquered. It was transformed. German soldiers who survived the crossing later said that the silence afterward was worse than the noise. The river no longer protects us, one wrote. It has joined them. And in a way, it had. From that moment, nature itself seemed to favor the side that built instead of the side that believed. General Eisenhower, standing on the eastern bank days after victory, watched the ducks still at work, carrying food, supplies, wounded men, and hope. He turned to a correspondent and said, "We didn't just cross the Rhine, we crossed a century." He was right. In 3 days, the world had shifted from the age of heroism to the age of systems, from the courage of individuals to the power of organization. Historians would later call it the most important amphibious operation of the European War, not for its bloodshed, but for its simplicity. There were no grand speeches, no iconic photographs, no single bridge to glorify, just quiet, endless movement, steel, rubber, water, and will. It was the perfection of the ordinary, the victory of practicality over pride. After the war, captured German officers studied the reports with disbelief. They had known about the DUKW. They'd even drawn its silhouette in their intelligence manuals. What they never imagined was the American decision to build 20,000 of them. That was the true weapon, not the machine, but the mindset that said enough is never enough. One of them, a former armored commander named Hans von Luck, would later write, "We Germans perfected the art of war. The Americans perfected the business of it. At the Rhine, business defeated art." His words, half bitter and half admiring, captured the truth. The old world of craftsmanship, of measured precision, of war as ritual, had been replaced by something faster, rougher, and infinitely more effective. The factories of Detroit had become the real front lines. Every rivet, every weld, every crankshaft carried the same purpose as a soldier's rifle. The DUKW was not beautiful, it was not elegant, but it was enough, and enough multiplied by 20,000 was overwhelming. After the surrender, the amphibious trucks kept working. They crossed the Elbe, the Danube, and later the flooded plains of the Netherlands, carrying grain and medicine instead of ammunition. They delivered mail to Allied garrisons, rescued stranded families, even ferried priests to ruined churches to conduct mass among the rubble. The vehicles that had once symbolized invasion now embodied mercy. And in that transformation lay the deepest meaning of their creation. One American sergeant, years later, stood beside a rusting duck displayed at a small museum and said quietly, "Ugly thing, isn't it? But it swam the Rhine when nothing else could. It got us there. It got us home." He touched the metal hull, and for a moment it seemed to hum again with the sound of history. Across the ocean, in a speech at West Point, General Omar Bradley described the lesson in a single sentence. The Rhine was not crossed by courage alone, but by imagination in steel. Those words became a philosophy that would shape the modern world. When bridges collapsed, engineers remembered the ducks. When new industries rose, they borrowed the same principle. Solve the problem first. Make it beautiful later. The Rhine crossing became more than a chapter of war. It became a parable of how human creativity could outpace tradition, how the will to adapt could defeat the will to resist. It showed that victory belongs not to the loudest army, but to the one that learns fastest. The Ducks had proven that. On the banks of the river today, there are no monuments to the DUKW crews, only quiet water, and sometimes, if you listen closely, the hum of traffic on distant bridges that never existed back then. Yet every crossing, every ferry, every supply chain in the modern world owes something to those strange, floating trucks. They taught humanity that barriers are temporary and that movement, steady, organized, unrelenting, will always find a way. When the sun sets over the Rhine, the water glows gold and red. It looks peaceful now, but beneath that calm surface lie the echoes of that spring, engines turning, propellers cutting, waves parting for history. Somewhere, the ghosts of those soldiers and engineers still cross the current, carrying not weapons, but memory. Because in the end, the Rhine was not conquered by an army. It was crossed by a civilization, and that civilization proved something eternal. That imagination, once set in motion, can make even a river surrender.